Imagine unearthing a dinosaur, right? And it's got this name straight out of Greek mythology.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, a creature that looks like it may be tangled with a river god and came out hornless.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Today, you're joining us as we plunge into the fascinating world of Achelousaurus. Seriously, forget those classic pointy-horned dinos for a sec.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
one had these, like, bony bosses instead. Pretty unique look.
It really is. And that's our mission for this deep dive, basically. To explore all the incredible details that make Achelousaurus, well, Achelousaurus.
Mhm.
We'll be looking closely at the paleontology, the fossil descriptions, tracing how theories about its family tree have changed,
Right.
and piecing together what its bones tell us about its life back then, late Cretaceous.
And where's this info coming from, mostly?
Good question. Our primary sources are really from those rich fossil beds up in Montana, the Two Medicine Formation.
Ah, okay.
It's given us this wonderfully detailed picture, still evolving, mind you, but pretty detailed.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, before we dig any deeper, we got to talk about the name, Achelousaurus. It just kind of rolls off the tongue.
It does.
It means Achelous lizard. And Achelouس, for anyone who doesn't know their Greek myths, was our river god.
Mm-hmm.
Famously lost a horn wrestling Hercules, so it's a pretty direct nod, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. To the fact that the adults specifically didn't have those big, obvious horns like some relatives.
And the species name, Hornery. That's for Jack Horner, right?
Exactly. Legendary paleontologist. His team actually found the first fragments back in '87. In Montana, of course.
Right.
Then more pieces turned up in '89. And it was Scott Sampson who formally described and named it in 1994 Achelousaurus horneri.
Gotcha. And there's like a main fossil, a type specimen.
Yep, the holotype. That's MOR 485. It's housed at the Museum of the Rockies.
Cool.
But what's really fascinating and useful is that we don't just have this one. The known fossils cover a whole range of ages.
Oh, really? Like babies?
Well, juveniles up to fully mature adults. And that's gold for paleontologists.
Yeah, because you can see how they changed as they grew up.
Precisely. We can track those developmental changes.
So paint a picture for us. If you bumped into one back then, what are we looking at?
Okay, picture this. A pretty sturdy four-legged animal. Maybe about 6 meters. That's like 20 feet long.
Okay, big-ish.
And weighing around 3 tons, maybe 3.3 short tons. It had a fairly short tail, big head.
With the beak, the classic ceratopsian beak.
Yeah, the hook beak. And then the frill, the bony shield off the back of the skull.
Right.
And that had a pair of pretty cool long spikes curving outwards.
Okay.
But the real kicker, the thing that makes it stand out, is what's going on, or rather not going on, above the eyes and on the snout.
The missing horns.
Well, missing typical horns in the adults. Instead, they had these rough, kind of roundish, bony bumps. We call them bosses.
Bosses. Okay.
And replacing sharp horns with these thick, probably keratin-covered bosses, it suggests maybe a different way of interacting.
Like pushing instead of poking.
Something like that, yeah. Maybe headbutting, maybe display.
And you mentioned keratin, like fingernails.
Exactly. Same stuff. So what we see in the fossil is the bone underneath. But in life, these bosses were almost certainly covered in a thick layer of keratin.
Ah, so the actual shape might have been a bit different than just the bone suggests.
Could have been, yeah. The exact shape in life is still a bit uncertain, but the possibilities are really interesting.
For fighting, maybe.
Definitely a possibility. Intraspecific combat, like headbutting contests for dominance. And almost certainly for visual display, too.
Showing off. Attracting mates.
You got it. Signaling status, maybe species recognition, all that social stuff.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty, the skull itself, that nasal boss, the one on the snout.
Right. So in adults, it's relatively small, kind of thin. But the surface texture is really rough, very pitted, like sandpaper almost.
Huh.
It covers about 2/3 of the top of the nasal bones. And interestingly, it's not as depressed or sunken in as the nasal boss you see on Pachyrhinosaurus.
Which is a close relative. We'll get to that.
Exactly. Now, here's where it gets really cool. How did this boss even develop evolutionarily?
Okay.
Well, there are a couple of main ideas. One is that it evolved from a horn that curved forward, kind of like an Ionosaurus,
I know that one.
which then basically fused down onto the nasal bone over time. The other idea, maybe it started as a more upright horn, like in Pachyrhinosaurus, that then broadened its base and extended forward.
So different starting points leading to a boss?
Potentially, yeah. And the holotype, MOR 485, actually shows this little depression, like an excavation, right at the front of the nasal boss.
A little clue, maybe?
Perhaps. But it shows the challenge, right? Trying to reconstruct these pathways just from the bones. The subtle details matter.
Okay, so that's the nose. What about above the eyes? No horns there either.
In adults, no. Instead, you get these big, rugged, oval-shaped bosses. They have these noticeable ridges running across them, transversely.
Rugged is a good word.
Yeah, and what's interesting is they aren't just formed by the postorbital bone, the one right over the eye socket.
Yeah.
They actually incorporate bits of the palpebral and prefrontal bones, too.
So multiple bones fused together.
Contributing to the structure, yeah.
Yeah.
And a really key feature is this sort of saddle-shaped grooves that runs across the top of the skull.
Okay.
It clearly separates that nasal boss from these supraorbital bosses above the eyes. It kind of forms a T shape if you look down on the skull.
Huh. That's specific.
It is. But remember that growth thing we mentioned?
Yeah, the juveniles.
Well, there's a subadult specimen, MOR 591, and it doesn't have the fully formed bosses yet. Instead, it has these long, low supraorbital horn cores.
Ah, so the horns kind of shrink or morph into bosses as they grow up?
That seems to be the pattern, yeah. A real transformation during maturation.
Wild. Okay, what about the frill? You mentioned spikes.
Right, the big parieto-squamosal frill. The squamosal bone part is actually shorter than the parietal bone part in Achelousaurus. But yeah, the spikes.
The showstoppers?
Definitely. You've got two really obvious large spikes, technically process 3, that curve outwards and away from each other.
Like Viking helmet horns.
A bit like that, yeah. Then, closer to the middle, there are two smaller sort of tab-like processes, process 2, pointing inwards towards the midline.
Okay.
What's missing, though, are those innermost spikes, process 1, that some other centrosaurians have.
Interesting. Any other frill details?
Yeah, along the top edge of the main bar of the frill, there's this neat row of rounded bumps. And then along the outer edge, you have a series of smaller bony knobs, 7 per side.
Wow, lots of ornamentation.
Oh, yeah. And another cool detail, those little bones around the edge, the epiccipitals, at least the third one in from the side, actually fuse directly onto the main frill bone.
So it's all becoming one solid structure.
Pretty much, yeah, strengthening that whole thing.
Anything interesting inside the skull?
Actually, yes. There's a cavity down the midline called the frontal fontanelle. It forms these air-filled sinuses right underneath those big supraorbital bosses.
They're pockets. Why are you?
Good question. Maybe for lightness, maybe shock absorption. We're not entirely sure. But there's some evidence this cavity might have closed up as the animal got older.
Oh.
Yeah, in the adult holotype, only the back part seems to remain open. So maybe it tells us something about how the skull changed, maybe got stronger as they matured.
Fascinating. Okay, so we have this unique-looking dinosaur. Where does it actually fit in the big dinosaur family tree?
Right, the evolutionary context. So within Ceratopsia, that's the main horned dinosaur group. Achelousaurus belongs to a smaller group called Pocurostra.
Picurostra. Big snouts.
You got it. And even more specifically, it's in the tribe Pecorinocerini.
Okay.
Now, initially, there was this really neat idea, a hypothesis suggesting a straight line of evolution.
A correct sequence.
Yeah, like Styracosaurus evolved into Ionosaurus, which then became Achelousaurus, which finally turned into Pecorinosaurus, a step-by-step transformation called anagenesis.
Oh, like one species gradually changing into the next over time.
Exactly. Seemed tidy, but paleontology is rarely that simple.
Ah, a plot twist.
Sort of. A fossil discovery, TMP 2002.76.1, showed bosses, but it was actually older than both Ionosaurus and Achelousaurus.
Oh, that messes up the straight line, doesn't it?
It definitely complicated things. But Jack Horner, who really pushed the anagenesis idea, had an explanation.
Which was?
He suggested maybe rapid evolution happened in a geographically isolated area. Perhaps rising sea levels shrunk their habitat along the coast of the western interior seaway.
Putting pressure on them to adapt quickly.
Exactly. Increased selection pressure. He even informally called these stages Taxon A, Taxon B, and Taxon C,
Which became?
which were later formally named Stellosaurus, Ionosaurus, and Achelousaurus. He argued they were chronospecies, different stages of the same evolving lineage.
And how did he support that?
Part of the argument was that the young dinosaurs of these different species looked very, very similar. The major differences really only showed up in the adults.
Suggesting it was about adult display or competition, sexual selection.
That was the idea, yeah. Changes driven by sexual selection becoming more pronounced in adults.
But you said it was complicated. Not everyone bought the straight line.
Correct. Scott Sampson, who named Achelousaurus, used a different method, cladistics. That's more about building family trees based on shared unique features.
Like branches splitting off.
Exactly. His analysis suggested a split, a divergence, between Inosaurus and Pachyrhinosaurus, with Achelousaurus branching off somewhere in that mix.
Okay, so a branching tree versus a straight line.
Right. And Peter Dodson also raised some points. He noted that having just one main pair of frill spikes, like Inosaurus and Achelousaurus do, might actually be a more primitive feature compared to Styracosaurus. He also floated the idea of sexual dimorphism. Maybe males and females look different.
Lots of debate then. So where do things stand now? What's the current thinking?
Well, the current consensus, based on more research and bigger analyses, generally puts Achelousaurus and Pachyrhinosaurus as sister groups.
Meaning they're each other's closest known relatives.
Yep. Within that Pachyrostera group.
Yeah.
And the tribe Pachyrhinosaurinae now includes Inosaurus, also Ceratopsians and Dinosaurs.
What about Rubisaurus?
Ah, good catch.
Yeah.
Rubisaurus is now generally considered the same thing as Styracosaurus albertensis, so synonymized.
Okay. And that taxon.
That got formally named Stellosaurus, so the picture is definitely more branched now than a simple straight line.
Okay, makes sense. So we know what it looked like, roughly where it fits in the family, but how did these animals actually live? What were those bosses for?
Right, the paleobiology. The big theories revolve around, well, showing off intraspecific display.
Making an impression on other Achelousaurus.
Exactly. And also combat, probably involving those bosses.
Headbutting.
Seems likely, yeah. Using those reinforced, possibly keratin-padded bosses to establish dominance, maybe fighting over mates or territory. It's all driven by sexual selection, social selection.
You mentioned muskoxen earlier.
Yeah, it's a comparison some researchers make. Modern muskoxen have these padded bosses and engage in headbutting rather than, say, locking horns like deer. Maybe Achelousaurus did something similar, a shift in fighting style.
And did they hang out in groups?
The evidence points that way. We find these things called monospecific bone bed.
Meaning?
Large accumulations of fossils, mostly just from one species, all found together. It's pretty strong evidence for herding behavior, which we see in lots of other centrosaurians too.
Safety in numbers.
Probably. Protection from predators, maybe better chances to find mates. Typical herd benefits.
What about their body heat? Were they slow, cold-blooded guys or more active?
Good question. Isotope analysis from their bones suggests they were homeothermic endotherms.
Meaning?
Basically, they could regulate their own body temperature to some extent. Not quite like modern mammals or birds, maybe,
Yeah.
but definitely not just relying on the sun like a typical reptile. Sort of an intermediate metabolism, perhaps.
More energetic than we used to think for dinosaurs.
Generally, yes. And there are some comparisons between subadult fossils, some maybe Achelousaurus, some definitely Inosaurs, that hint Achelousaurus might have grown a bit faster, reached adult size quicker. But that's still tentative.
Interesting. Okay, last piece of the puzzle. Their world. Where and when exactly did they live?
We know this pretty well. They lived in the Two Medicine Formation, which is now in Glacier County, Montana.
And when was this?
Late Cretaceous period, specifically the Campanian age, around 74.2 million years ago.
What was Montana like back then? Swampy jungle?
Actually, no. The climate seems to have been pretty warm, but also semi-arid. Distinct wet and dry seasons.
Semi-arid. Why?
Probably because the early Rocky Mountains starting to form to the west, they created a rain shadow effect.
Ah, okay. So not lush forests everywhere.
Likely sparser vegetation overall, which means water sources like oxbow lakes would have been really important, concentrating both the herbivores and the plants they ate.
And you mentioned bone beds before. Could droughts be involved?
Very likely. Periodic droughts could have caused mass die-offs near dwindling water sources, which is one strong explanation for how those dense bone beds formed.
Grim. Who else was around? Any neighbors?
Oh yeah, it was a busy place. Other dinosaurs included hadrosaurs like Prosaurolophus, the Ankylosaur Scolosaurus, another hadrosaur Hypacrosaurus, and crucially, Inosaurs lived around the same time and place.
And predators. Gotta have predators.
Absolutely Tyrannosaurids, possibly Albertosaurus early on, maybe scavenging, and then later, the big one in that specific area seems to have been Dasipultosaurus horneri.
Named after Horner, too.
Indeed. Now, having Achelousaurus and Inosaurus living together is interesting.
Yeah, how did they manage that? Different food.
That's the hypothesis. Niche partitioning. Maybe Achelousaurus, with its heavier skull build and potentially stronger bite, could handle tougher plants than Inosaurus. Allows them to coexist.
Makes sense. Wow. Okay, so wrapping this up, we've really dug into Achelousaurus, this very unique centrosaurine swapping horns for bosses.
Yeah, a really distinctive character in the late Cretaceous cast.
Its exact spot on the family tree is still debated a bit.
Absolutely. The science is always evolving as we find more evidence, anagenesis versus cladistics, that whole discussion.
But no doubt it was a key player in its ecosystem back then. And just thinking about those ongoing debates, it really highlights how much we're still figuring out from these amazing fossils.
It really does. And isn't it fascinating to think how much we can figure out just from subtle variations in bone? Bosses instead of horns, the shape of frill spikes.
Yeah, tiny details telling huge stories.
Exactly. It shows the incredible amount of information locked away in these remains from millions of years ago.
Yeah.
And our understanding, like you said, it keeps changing with new finds, new ways of analyzing them.
Makes you wonder.
What else is still buried out there? What other secrets are locked in those bones, just waiting for the next discovery? It definitely encourages you to keep exploring, keep learning about these incredible animals and their worlds. The
Yeah.
ceratopsian paleontology is just a fascinating field.